Going on, everybody? Welcome back to Around the 412. Smitty here. Of course, no Tyler this week. 2-week vacation in Europe for Tyler, which, by the way, we got to get on him about this. Like, who takes a 2-week vacation to Europe during the NFL draft? I guess that's what happens when you're the only one in your family that is into sports. So I called in some reinforcements, and I would say no slight to Tyler, but a bit of an upgrade here. Dan Orlovsky, ESPN, joining me on the show to talk about the Steelers draft. I want to get his thought on pick number 20, state of the Steelers, all that good stuff. Dan, how we doing, man?
I'm fantastic. I got to meet this Tyler guy. I don't even know if I can get a 2-week trip to Europe ever, let alone right around the NFL draft. I'm planning that for when my kids go to college. So.
Yeah, so that's the thing. Like, his dad has been trying to make this vacation happen for a couple years. They're finally in a spot where, like, Tyler just got married. A little over a year ago now. His sister has been married for a little bit. They just got a house. So, like, everybody's in a spot now where they feel like they can do this. So,
good for them.
Yeah. But Dan, before we get into the draft, because that's what I mainly want to talk about, you were one of the first people that I feel like when the Steelers acquired Russell Wilson, was kind of vocal about, like, he's not as bad of a player as what people are making seem. And I feel like a little bit of people on both sides of the fence here in Pittsburgh. So I just kind of wanted to get your thought on that. Like, what do you think Pittsburgh is getting in Russell Wilson at this point in his career?
Yeah, I still think he's a player that you could win games with at quarterback, as long as a lot of the other pieces are in good places. They don't have to be in perfect places, but good places. I don't think that Russell is the Russell that was trending towards a Hall of Famer in Seattle. You know, he's definitely has fallen off in some ways. A little bit of the movement and the mobility, but he was a much improved player last year in 23 than he was in 22. And I think, and I've said this, I don't think the Broncos were like adamant about getting rid of Russell Wilson, the person on the field or the player on the field. I do think that there was a little bit of the off the field and relationship stuff, and certainly the contract value that was probably a bigger factor. So, with the style that Pittsburgh has wanted to play under Mike for a long time, Coach Tomlin, and for what Russell Wilson is now, like, he is still a quarterback that you can win your fair share of games with.
So if you look at, obviously him being part of this now, the offseason change that the Steelers have undergone, reshaping the quarterback room, Patrick Queen brought in Deshaun Elliott, these other additions, as we sit here kind of like resetting the roster before the draft, what is your take on the state of the Steelers, like just in general, when you look at this roster?
Yeah, I mean, it's so I'll start defensively. I still think that the defense underperformed last year, given how expensive it was. I know Minka had injuries and certainly TJ, but it still wasn't that suffocating defense. The middle of the field was a weakness. Obviously, Patrick, in his addition, hopefully attacks that. So I think the defense with some of the youth, Joey Porter Jr. having to carry their weight a little bit more. And I think some of the younger players hopefully get back to that defense being a little bit more of a complementary unit than, hey, defenses or offenses are having more success than that, certainly Pittsburgh fans are accustomed to against that defense. So I want to see if that group takes their step forward or kind of carries their weight a little bit more. Offensively, I think the offensive line was a I don't want to call it a bright spot, because I still think they need to get better, but I do think that the offensive line started to create an identity. Something that had been missing over the past couple of years was that physical element. So I think that you have to be encouraged. Obviously, the two backs played really well. Pat's got to stay healthy. I think he's a really good tight end. So, there's a lot of really good and encouraging pieces. I don't want to come on and lie to you and sit here and say, hey, this is going to be the best, top 5 defense in the NFL or a top 5 offense in the NFL. I think there's pieces that, get them to play winning football. And there's some holes that still have to get fixed in the draft. But, if you were going to take them and put them in the AFC East, I'd sit there and say, they could contend to win that division. They don't play there, and so I think that, obviously they, as of right now, I put roster-wise, I think you have to put them behind Baltimore, even with some of their pieces lost, and probably behind Cleveland as far as totality of roster. We'll see what Deshaun is, and right in that conversation with Cincinnati, just because Cincinnati's got holes as well.
Yeah, getting Joe back, though, obviously going to be big for them, and we'll see what
Sure.
they look like in 2024. Deontay Johnson trade. That's the last thing I want to bring up before we dive into the draft. What was your thought about that? Obviously, not just totally related to football. Deontay's a good
Yeah,
player. If you were just trading him, you would think that they would have gotten more back than what they did, at least in my mind. But we're talking about holes that they have on the roster going into the draft. That certainly created one that we weren't necessarily expecting to have.
there's no question about it. It created probably a top two need, when it comes to, hey, we got to go get a receiver to replace Deontay. Like I always say this as a quarterback, there's two things that you really want out of a wide receiver. And I don't really care how you get there or what it looks like. Do you get open? And when you're open, do you catch it and do something with it? I think Deontay would probably check all three of those things. Certainly those two big boxes. Deontay can get open, he can separate, he plucks it, and he does something with it. And those, we could say all we want, like those guys just aren't super easy to find and replace, even though this is a wildly deep class. So I wasn't shocked that there was a decision to move on, and I wouldn't have been shocked if there was the decision to move on from George either and keep Deontay. As talented as George is, I probably would have been a little bit more surprised, just because, when we had, the Steelers-Ravens game, Coach Tomlin made it very clear, like, hey, there's talent there that we have to just figure our way through, and so it does create a kind of a need at that wide receiver spot.
So we mentioned top two need going into this draft. Let's talk about this draft. I actually want to start, though. I mentioned pick number 20. Obviously, I want to work way through. But offensive line, certainly in play. Cornerback in play. If you look at, who they've met with, it's pretty much across the board at the top. The same amount for centers, tackles, corners. So what in your mind, looking at how you feel like the board could potentially fall, what is like the best case scenario for the Steelers at 20?
Center. Because it's a need, the Johnson Myers, I believe, from Oregon. And this is why I say center, because so when you run the system that Arthur Smith runs, and Arthur's system is a little bit of his own thing, but there's a lot of attachment to the West Coast, Bill Callahan, Mike Shanahan offensive run game, that zone run game. There's a couple things. I was fortunate when I played in that offense. I was fortunate to be with this center named Chris Myers, who was out of the University of Miami. He was multiple Pro Bowler for the Houston Texans. There was a couple things that he had that all centers in this offense have to have. Number one, you have to play laterally very quick. It's just the style of the offensive run game. Like, you need a center that can quickly snap and get to, like what we call like a reach block. You're trying to get to the outside of a defensive tackle. So you have to have that lateral quickness. Number two, you got to be really intelligent. Arthur in this offense, they don't place a ton of pre-snap intellectual burden on the quarterback. It's often the center getting up there and knowing, okay, the front is here, so we need to move our landmark to that linebacker and not this linebacker, or we have to kick it to this backside linebacker to create the leverage or the double team. So you got to be really intelligent. And then they also, more often than not, handle the protection stuff. And again, these coaches that come from that world, they don't want to burden the quarterback. They would prefer the quarterback to just play fast pre-snap, like get to the line of scrimmage, get the snap, and then we play, rather than being bogged down with, okay, if the defense does this, then I have to do this, and then make sure I do this. They don't want that. And, I don't think you want Russell or Justin doing that as well. So I think that center and the type of center is probably their primary person that they should get.
I love that was your answer, because that's kind of where I wanted to go, because I was watching another podcast. Thomas Dimitroff, former Atlanta Falcons GM, was talking about centers, and you have to be like a special center to go in the first round. And then you see, in Kuiper's rankings, or I'm sorry, mock draft, he has Frazier and Jackson Powers Johnson, who's the center you were alluding to, down at 47, down at 47 and 57. And I'm just like, man, these guys are getting pushed down the board a bit there. Graham Barton's kind of the one that we've seen in the first round. Obviously, the position versatility is going to give him a little bit of an edge too. Like, don't even know where exactly teams are going to see him. Probably some teams might see him across the board. So, but I wanted your take on that. Like, why is it that we're seeing the centers get pushed down a bit? And because of what you're saying with Arthur Smith's system, should they be the team that does value them more than anybody else does?
Yeah. I think the centers are getting pushed down a little bit because of some of the other positions getting pushed up. Maybe it's not just these guys aren't worthy of X pick, but the quarterbacks are going to go, the receivers are going to go, the tackles are going to go, and so I think then that when you get that big group, I could see 10 receivers going to the top like 45. They're just that good this year. So when you see that group go up, so then maybe it props up a corner or two, and so I just think that maybe that the elevation of some of those other groups has pushed those guys back down. I understand the premise of like, hey, to be a center, or to go in the first round, you got to be different. I've been, 18 months ago, I kind of started the thought process of like, I think that the NFL is going back to the early 2000s, in many ways, and the style of play that we're going to see, and it's not going to be as, spread out. And I the interior players, both on the offensive and defensive lines, are going to be more, important and prevalent than maybe like the elite edge rushers. They're obviously going to be always important, but like, having those guys and the ability to control the interior of the line of scrimmage on both sides is going to come back and be equally as important as it was certainly when I got into the league. So I'm a believer that like having a good center is better than having two average guards.
Yeah, and I was gonna mention too, like I almost wonder if we're going to start seeing that shift. Like football happens in trends, like
Yep.
things happen. It's always like in waves, and you saw that the way that the guard market and free agency just kind of exploded this year with
Yep.
guys getting paid. And the fastest way to a quarterback is through the interior. So I wonder if maybe we do see the center position prioritized more because of this. So
Yeah.
I'm curious to see. I think that there are some Jackson Powers Johnson, Graham Barton, both I believe are worthy of the 20th selection if they are on the board. And if one of those tackles doesn't fall, I like Mims a lot. I think he would be a great selection as well. But you mentioned the receiving class too. Obviously, we talked about the Deontay Johnson trade a little bit. Is there somebody, because like at least for us Steeler fans, and I know that you're not a Steelers fan, but I wonder if this ever happens to you, where you just see a player, you think about a team, and you just think this is a perfect fit. Is there a receiver in this class that you just look at and you're like, yep, that's a Steeler?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of guys that are representative of the Steelers. Like Ladd McConkey would be a player that I think like, man, he reminds me of a Steeler. The way I've looked at it, Zach, is a little bit more. So I constantly go back to, Arthur Smith's two previous places, and different than the Steelers. When he was in Tennessee and they were rolling, it was the big bodied guys. It was AJ. It was they had Julio there it was trying to get big physical receivers because the play action game, they're thrown so often over the middle of the field. So the bigger framed guys were one of the reasons why Ryan Tannehill had that resurgence of his career. So naturally, I would go to like an A.D. Mitchell out of Texas, or I would go to a Xavier Legette out of South Carolina, just the big physical guys. I'm trying to give you the realistic spot, maybe not the top 4 or 5 guys, trying to think of these bigger framed wide receivers. And then I go to Atlanta, and obviously they had Drake London, and he's a bigger framed receiver. But one of the reasons why that offense sputtered in Atlanta, it wasn't because they didn't run the football well. It wasn't because they didn't have an offensive line that played at a high level. It was really, number one, the quarterback play wasn't good enough. And 2, they didn't really have vertical speed. When you're running a play action pass centric offense, there's a couple things that you have to have for it to be ideal. Obviously, run the football, you have to have good self fakes, and you have to have that big receiver that's going to cross the middle of the field. But to go really to be what exactly you want, there has to be someone that lifts coverage or burns the coverage that won't get lifted. And so that there's part of me that goes, well, I just mentioned A.D. Mitchell out of Texas. Maybe it is Xavier Worthy with his vertical speed, paired with, is George going to be that 15-yard, that 20-yard, that 25-yard, intermediate chunk receiver for them. So it's a little bit of, I guess, unknown from my angle is like, are they going to stay true to like the Steelers vibe, or are they going to try to stay true to like what Arthur Smith and the
Right.
receivers that he's had vibe.
Right. Yeah. Cause like if you talk about, okay, if you're just looking at Deontay Johnson and what he brought to the table, like Ricky Pearsall, a guy that understands, can find the soft spots and coverage, really good route runner, can run everything on the tree. But like, does he perfectly fit what Arthur Smith is looking for?
Exactly.
Like the question that I've asked myself basically is if Deontay Johnson wasn't on this roster, which now he isn't,
Right.
would you be looking to acquire a receiver like that? And I don't think the answer is yes.
I agree.
So yeah, it kind of gets my mind running going through this draft class, looking for who the perfect receiver for them is. They're going to add one, obviously, pretty early
Right.
in my mind. And they might even double dip there. That could be something they do at both 51 and maybe later on as well. There's some really intriguing dudes there to be around on day 3, obviously. In that Deontay Johnson trade, though, getting back Deontay Jackson, who has some inside-outside versatility. I would say the tackling issues specifically for the Steelers, maybe keep him out of there for them because they asked their guys in the nickel, obviously, to come up and help and run support and do some slot blitz stuff. So I don't know that he's to be a great fit for them in the slot. And then Corey Trice and Darius Rush, interesting lottery tickets on the outside of opposite Joey Porter Jr. But like day one right now, they roll the football out there and they got to play a game tomorrow. I don't know who's playing in the slot. So that's also a position where I expect them to add one. Is there a guy there that like anywhere down the board? This is another position where I think you could go all the way into like early day 3 and find a guy that's going to contribute early. But like, how do you feel about this slot corner class?
Yeah, I don't want to pretend that I know this slot corner class that in depth like that. Like we get so caught up in during the draft class in the draft process of hyper focused on some of the offensive skill players and whatnot. I do know this though, like going back to the thought of like the defensive tackles, if you don't have, like I grew up we're watching his son be a superstar in the league, but like I grew up in the era where Antoine Winfield, excuse me, was like, he was one of the best defensive players in football. And we've talked about it on NFL Live a ton, going back to like when Jalen Ramsey initially went to LA and they started to kick him inside, and how important that nickel was becoming again in the NFL, and Kenny Moore from Indy, being such a big deal because that nickel nowadays really has to be a 4-tool player. I mean, you have to be capable of playing in zone coverage. You have to be able to play, the RPO game at a pretty high level. You have to be able to be willing in support in the run game and tackle really well in space. And then you got to be able to play man coverage because that's attached to defending the RPOs at a higher rate. So, that's a very important position in today's, NFL defenses. Is just you've got to be capable of being good at so many different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last one I want to hit on, because I don't know that people are looking at it as like they have to do this. Maybe they feel comfortable enough with Dan Moore Jr. for one more year, but offensive tackle, especially in this class where, we're going to see probably 7-ish go in the first round. Is that a group that if you were the Steelers, you'd be looking to tap into? Because like if it's not in the first round, they're probably not getting a guy to unseat Dan Moore Jr. right away. I mentioned Mims, but like, is there another guy potentially? Like, how do you feel about this tackle class in general? And would you be looking to tap into it to upgrade upon Dan Moore Jr.?
Yeah, I mean, like when they're sitting at 20, is the run on quarterbacks and receivers higher? Where do the tackle fashion now is unbelievable from Penn State. One of the cool things that I get to do here is you call college football games occasionally as well. So, I've called a couple. I remember calling his games early on. I've called Mims games early on. Obviously, Joe's not going to be there, but called a couple of Notre Dame games. So I think when you hear the offensive line people that really know that position and that grouping, and they talk about this class, they say this could be the best offensive tackle class of the NFL draft in the last 20 to 25 years. So I think the 20 position is just really fascinating because, there's 3 positions for Pittsburgh that you could sit there and not be upset that they take. We talked about center, we talked about receiver, and we talked about tackle. And if they took any of those 3 at that 20 spot, you could sit there and make the case and be like, yeah, like that's a justifiable pick, and I think one of those 3, I would be very surprised that it's not their first round pick. And I would be surprised if 2 out of those 3 are in their first 2 rounds.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because they can obviously we talked about the depth at wide receiver and slot corner. They can wait until, later on in day 2, even early day 3 for that slot. So that'll be interesting to see. Then I don't want to spend too much. I don't want to spend like any time really going back in hindsight, but I just want to get your thought on it. Like, did you have any idea that the Kenny Pickett situation would play out the way that it did so quickly?
No. I mean, I remember. I'll go back to draft day and when they took him, and I was like, reminds me a lot of Mitchell Trubisky because I think they had Mitchell as the backup at that point. And I wasn't down on Kenny. I was just like, he's fine. He's a good player, and I get the pick and whatnot. And then, last preseason, I was way more encouraged by Kenny because I was like, okay, he looks really good. He looks like a different player in many ways, and he was aggressive down the field. And then, during the season, there was obviously I was very outspoken about my displeasure with Matt Canada and the offense and the predictability of it and whatnot. And there was a moment where I was like, like I can't put that all on Canada. I didn't think Kenny played well, and then it happened very quickly. And it's just when you're in that division and in that conference, everything gets expedited at that position. And I think Pittsburgh sat there and was like, okay, we think Kenny's probably a decent player and a good player, but like that's not good enough for us anymore. And so I was surprised that it happened so quickly this offseason, though. Sure.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay. And last thing before I get you out of here, do you have a take, whether it's like something that you don't, maybe some other people think is wild as it comes to the draft, like somebody you think is going to go higher, somebody that you think is going to go lower?
I mean, I've said I would take Jaden Daniels #1. Obviously, it doesn't seem like Chicago's going to do that.
Yeah.
I would be very surprised if all 6 of those quarterbacks don't go in the top 20. I think all 6 of them are. I've said this, Zach. Like Caleb was #1 coming out of high school. Jaden was #1 coming out of high school. JJ was #5 coming out of high school. Drake was #9. Like the talent is. Bo was #20. I think like the talent is remarkable, even with Michael Penix's injury history. I just think all 6 go in that top 20.
And I'm hoping that it happens before 20 because that would be great for the Steelers board.
Exactly.
So last thing, prediction we've talked about who we think would be best case scenario, who could potentially be some names. I want a prediction from you who the Steelers are going to draft at 20.
I'll go with the center out of Oregon. I just
Jackson Powers Johnson will be a Pittsburgh Steeler.
There's something about knowing Arthur's offense, relatively schematically well, and when I watch him play and the responsibility that he had at Oregon, also, the learning from with his past, I think that's a match.
Got it. All right. Well, man, this was a ton of fun. I can't thank you enough for doing this, especially 2 days before the draft. I was so hell bent on getting you on here for this reason. I think that you do the best job, if I can give you your flowers real quick, of marrying kind of like the advanced approach to football, but also the eye test. I think nobody does it better than you. So I'm so glad that we were able to make this happen.
No, I appreciate it, dude. Appreciate you working with the schedule. I know it was a headache with some of that as well.
No. It's draft week, man. I totally get it.
Social media is awful, but this is a moment when there's a benefit to it. So I appreciate you, dude.
Yeah, absolutely. Big shout out to Dan Orlovsky of ESPN, of course. You guys, I don't need to tell you where you can find him, where you can find his work, but I will put the links to his stuff in the description of the show just in case. Again, thanks, Dan, for taking the time.
Appreciate you, dude.
Yeah, all right.